in any brief intervention, you want to have some motivational interviewing.
Yeah.
So we want to stick to the 4 main processes of motivational interviewing: engaging, focusing, evoking, and planning. And so I did a little bit of each of those with both patients. The engaging is basically starting to connect with a person, making them feel at ease, reflecting generally what they're saying to you without any sort of direction or focus, just to put them at ease and lessen their possible reluctance to be there.
And that came out so well. You could tell with the young man that he started to open up and talk more about how he was drinking and the quantities, almost as if it was, and even with the young lady, she got much less defensive over time. She remained a little bit reluctant, I'd say, or a little more reluctant, but still you could tell her, even in her body language, that she was lightening up. That she was, she was engaged.
And some basic empathy reflections and acknowledging how tough things have been for them. That's a good way to get the ball rolling and engage. The second part is focusing. So you might have even heard me say, so could we focus in a little bit or zero in on this? That's where the clinician doing the brief intervention decides in his or her own mind, this is my target. This is what I'd like to get to with this person. So it is directive, as MI is, but at the same time you're asking permission, always acknowledging that person's autonomy to say no or yes to the conversation.
Yeah, and you did that many times throughout both those conversations.
Sure.
And I agree, it really seems like that's the point where you really began to be more directive. It was almost, it's almost clearly like a change, a shift in how you were doing the work.
I'm glad you noticed that, and that is a tricky part of it, so you want to be careful with that. You want to tread lightly, but MI is a directive approach. And my take on it is that if you don't say to someone, here's what I'd like to talk about, here's where I'd like you to go, but that's just me, would it be okay for us to talk about it? If you don't do that to a great extent, then you do run the risk of being directive where the person remains really reluctant.
Yeah, no, you clearly asked permission, and you did it in a way that they both not only tolerated, but they seemed to want to go that direction with you.
Right. Sure. So the third step is to evoke. So evoking. What are you trying to evoke? You're trying to evoke reasons for change, their own motives or motivation to make a change, but we're trying to stay connected into the thing I focused on. So I don't want them to talk about why they're motivated to, change their son's school. I want to talk about how they're motivated to reduce their drinking or to go to treatment.
Yeah.
And that's where you heard the readiness ruler, the scale question, and why they didn't pick a lower number. And perhaps I also asked a few times what would be important to them for changing.
And what I really saw clear of that is that the questions that you had asked on engaging them were the same themes that you brought in that you already knew were important because they were the themes that were most concerning to them coming in.
Right.
For the young man, it was really his partner. He said he even asked if she could go to treatment with him. That was one of his, and for the young woman, it was her husband and her son that seemed to be some of the compelling reasons why they were there.
Right.
And you brought those into.
Well, two things on that. I brought them in because somebody did a good screening before they came to see me, and that's a big part of brief intervention. The screening comes first. So I know that, but I also want to pick up on the cues from the patient. What are the things that are most important to them? So the young woman was talking about her husband and her son. She wasn't talking about how distressed she was that she was found passed out on the bathroom floor. So even though I mentioned it, I didn't hone in on that because that's not her main motivation. So it remains very client or patient focused in that regard.
And that is critical. So often the people that we work with believe that they need to focus on certain risks that are concerning to them, that are concerning to the health provider and not the patient.
Right.
And what we know about this work is it's really important to focus on the risks that are concerning to the patient.
That's a great point. But to our medical practitioners out there, we want to say if there is something that you feel compelled to say, you do say it. Right? Or you say, well, look, from my vantage point, here's what you should look at, I think. We'll see how that plays out. But it sounds like these other things would be more motivating for you to change.
Okay. Yeah. So let's get to the fourth.
Right. The fourth is planning. Very straightforward, planning on what to do next. And the main question I ask to get that part going is, what's the next step, if any? And that phrase, people always ask me, is that phrase important? Can I shorten it and say, what's your next step? Well, no, because then you're presuming that the patient will take a next step. And I want to reinforce that person's autonomy all the way through. And I jump off of where the patient says they might want to go.
Yeah, and in both these cases, it seemed to work well enough that they both started to really talk about how they would bring down their use,
Right.
even though they came to you a little more reluctant,
Right.
particularly the young woman. And yet she was ready to at least start to look at bringing the daily consumption
Right.
into more or less risky levels.
They both were more willing at the end of that step. But what did they say first? Both of them first responded with well, you tell me, or I'm not so sure that there's really a connection.
Right.
The 3 steps prior to that went well, but then when we got to the end, when they really feel like I got to do something now, even though I wasn't saying that, they kind of became a little more reluctant again.
Yeah.
So it's important for the practitioner to ride that out and to go back almost to an engaging strategy where you say, yeah, I get it. Who wants to have to do this? This is
Hard
rough.
work.
It's up to you, though. And I think ultimately did bring them to some willingness.